Hello, welcome back to Teacher Jeff 40K. Today I'm going to put together a list that is a way to build a decent army that will get you a win, get you through a game. It's not really like, I'm not going for a tournament list. And I'm not going for anything necessarily hyper competitive. That's not really what I want to do. Now, if you want hyper competitive, you can have a look at what are the popular units right now. I mean, a lot of it is it's as simple as what are the new units that Games Workshop are selling. They're probably pretty good. You can go and buy those. What I wanted to do was put together a list for 2,000 points that is a take on all comers list, so a way to deal with just about everything relatively well, cover all your bases, but also use a variety of units that are both good and, I guess, underappreciated, or some would say overcosted, but as a demonstration that as long as you have units in your army with a job to do, and you know what their job is, then you should be able to use just about anything. Obviously, there are suboptimal builds. There are some things that cost more than others, some things that are more point effective, whatever have you. That's not really the point of this video. I'm not trying to find the best models or the best units that do something like anti-infantry, for example, super well. That's not what I'm trying to do. So what I've put together is a mix of new and old Space Marine units, put them together in an army. Each unit has a job to do. Each unit has as simple as that, a job to do, something they are supposed to accomplish on the battlefield, sometimes more than one thing that they can do. And I have taken some units that are considered less good, but equipped them properly to do a certain job. So we'll have a look here. I've made 2,000 points. I've managed to put together a battalion detachment and a vanguard detachment. So I've got some troops, some HQs, some elite choices, and a few other goodies all the way through, and just a variety of different tactics. So a lot of the stuff you're seeing, with one exception, it's only going to be one of each type of unit. And this is to sort of give you an idea that all different units within the Space Marine Codex, or within any codex for that matter, can be put to some use in some capacity. So I'm not necessarily going to have, 3 Predator tanks, for example, or, something like that. The idea is, okay, so you've got those 3 Predator tanks. Instead, have 1 Predator tank, another unit that does anti-tank very well, and then another unit that does anti-tank very well. That's the idea that I'm trying to get across here, is that you can take different units to fulfill the same job as a certain unit. If you want to go out and buy 3 of one thing because they're really good, go ahead, do that. That's fine. You're going to win games. You're going to be fine. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad way to play. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I want to show is that regardless of the units that you may have, whether you are returning to the hobby after a long time, or you inherited an army from somebody, or you found some stuff for super cheap, or you just like the look of certain models, I'm going to go through a different variety of things, what their jobs are, and other units they might potentially be replaced by to do the same work. So let's have a look here. Again, I'm going to reiterate, this is not a tournament list. That's not really what I like to do here. What I'm doing is I'm putting together a list that is going to function on the table, that really will win you games. But the idea here, I'm not saying copy the list I've put together here. What I'm saying is I have an army idea. I have an idea of what my army wants to do, and I've picked units and equipped them to fulfill certain roles on the table. And the the advantage is not so much in the models that I'm using, but more in the cohesiveness of the army. I will not be using anything from Forge World. I'm going to just be staying straight to the Codex, the standard Space Marine Codex, to keep it as simple as possible. So to start off, like I said, I've got a battalion detachment and I have a Vanguard detachment. So that'll net me 9 command points total, which isn't bad at 2,000 points. It's not amazing, but it's not bad either. And then I will be using a custom successor chapter. So I won't be using any of the main chapters like Ultramarines or Iron Hands or anything like that. I'm going to be using a custom chapter to put together an army that I want to put together. And the idea here too is that I want to show that you can really build a good army with whatever you want. That's the idea I'm trying to put across here. You don't necessarily have to go out, buy the Iron Hands book, get the Iron Hands special character, and only use tanks. That'll win you games. It's going to do very, very well. But if you're leaning more towards the narrative side, or you've always liked the idea of putting together an army that you can imagine doing well on a real battlefield, but that can still win you games, this is what I'm looking for. So what I've done is I've used successor chapter tactics, and I've used 2 that are pretty good and very, very, not versatile, but they're successor chapter tactics that are universally good. So they're not necessarily situational, and even if you don't know what you're going up against, they'll help you out. So the 2 tactics I've chosen are Master Artisans, which is basically salamanders. It's when a unit with this tactic fires Overwatch, or is chosen to shoot or fight with, you can reroll a single hit and a single wound. Nice and easy. Every unit gets a reroll for hit and wound. You're always going to be using that. You're always going to be hitting things and wounding things in shooting and in combat. So that's never going to be not useful. And then the other one I've chosen is Warded. When a model with this tactic would lose a wound as the result of a mortal wound, roll 1d6. On a 5+, the wound is not lost. That one, again, is very universal. So it's not necessarily limited to mortal wounds from psychic powers. It includes those. But it's also mortal wounds from any source. There will be weapons with, if you wound on a 6, for example, mortal wounds in addition. Or if a vehicle or a big monster dies nearby, it'll deal mortal wounds if you roll a 6, if the vehicle explodes or the monster thrashes out. You can avoid these with this 5-up. And this is very, very, very useful. If you come up against a strong Psyker army, this will help you out. If you come up against an army with no Psykers, this will still be useful to you. You'll be avoiding mortal wounds a third of the time, which is very, very, very good. Considering Space Marines are already strong and already good at dealing with regular wounds from high-powered weapons or armor-piercing stuff, they're usually pretty good at that anyways with their higher toughness and good armor. So this Warded ability adds another element of survivability to your army, and it's going to keep you on the table longer, regardless of your opponent. So that's what we put together here. So with that in mind, I've put together a list at 2,000 points, or I believe it's 1,999, so incredibly close to 2,000 points. So let's start us off. In no particular order here, I'm going to start off, let's dig into the battalion, but actually there is a particular order and you'll see why in a second. I am going to be using a Storm Raven. So that guy we're going to put right here. And the reason I'm pulling him out first is because he really does dominate space on the table. I'm not going to use his stand. I learned that lesson the hard way a while back in another video I made. So this guy is is a very good unit. It's not one of those underrated ones or anything like that. It's an incredibly good unit, the Storm Raven. So what I'm going to do with this is I've got a missile launcher on the front, I've equipped the Hurricane Bolters, I've got the twin las cannon on the top, and then of course the Storm Strike missiles that it comes automatically equipped with. So this thing is very good at dealing with heavy targets, but also if it gets close enough, it's got 2 Hurricane Bolters. And then there's the transport capacity. So this thing is a big chunk of the meat of this army. And I've also used it as a transport. So what I've put in here is I've put together 5 Terminators with Lightning Claws. So it's a relatively cheap loadout for Terminators, because Lightning Claws actually went down in price in the most recent codex. So the squad will cost you 165 points for the 5 Terminators. It's a little steep, but at the same time, it's still incredibly strong. With Shock Assault, each of these guys is getting an extra attack if they charge, or if they are charged, which is terrific. And because they each have Lightning Claws, they're getting an additional attack because of that as well, and you reroll all wounds with the Lightning Claws. So it's a decent unit for shredding infantry. So this is the job for this unit. We go inside this, the Storm Raven, with these guys, and a chaplain with a jump pack. So these 6 models fill out the entirety of the troop capacity, which is 12 for the Storm Raven. Because each of them will count as being 2 models for the purposes of troop capacity. And you're going to get some serious support for your Terminators. So with the Chaplain, with the new powers, regardless of which one you decide to choose, the Litanies of Battle, you always do know the original power that the Chaplain has always had, which is that reroll all hits in the fight phase, which is incredibly useful for a team like this, where if you get that power to work, then you reroll all hits in the fight phase, and you reroll all wounds because they have Lightning Claws. Now, for the purposes of litanies, this is a small nuance. You may want to have this guy not inside the transport, but following it. Because you must declare your litany at the start of the battle round, which is not necessarily the start of your turn. It could be the start of the opponent's turn. So when you do that at the start of the battle round, then the power goes off. And like most abilities, if he is inside a transport, you're not going to get it. So that's something to consider when deploying this guy. But he works incredibly well with these guys. And you could use his regular litany, and I would say for this guy, you could use a variety of different ones. I would use Mantra of Strength, just because it's really interesting. So let's say he's not around the Terminators for whatever reason. The Terminators have died, they're not out yet. You've decided to move him somewhere else. Mantra of Strength allows you to make the Chaplain alone very strong. So that one is, if this litany is inspiring, add 1 to the model's attacks, strength, and add 1 to the damage of melee weapons. So that would make him really strong already. And in fact, I want to give him a relic too. So I would give him the Benediction of Fury. This will replace his Crozius, which is his close combat weapon, with basically the same thing, but a better version. +2 strength, -2 AP, 3 damage. Now if you have Mantra of Strength, that is +3 strength, -2 AP, 4 damage, he gets an additional attack when resolving an attack made with the weapon. Unmodified hit rolls of 6 inflict mortal wounds in addition to the damage. That's really good. For just 90 points for this guy right here. So, nice and strong. And you can keep him right there. with them, or you can fly them around otherwise. So their job here, this, is to get deep up the field, somewhere to expose a flank of the enemy, preferably a flank that has light to medium infantry, so that you can shred them with these guys. And then you leave the heavy stuff to the twin las cannon, the missile launcher, and the storm strike missiles, and maybe some other long-range firepower that you may have. So we've got these guys right here. Then I have also added a few Primaris models. So I have a heavy support team right here of 5 Hellblasters. Again, these guys are, it's no secret, very strong. The -4 AP to their rifles is incredibly powerful, and they have decent range and the ability to overcharge and deal with multiple targets. The idea behind this unit is very, very simple. Shoot pretty much anything. Honestly, with the exception of ultra-light infantry, these guys can deal with pretty much anything that comes onto the board. So that's their job. They are a very versatile unit. Then I put together some more troops and other things. Let's have a look here. So let's see. Okay, I have got a unit of scouts. I've got 3 bolt guns, a heavy bolter, and a shotgun, and they will be riding inside a land speeder storm. So their job is to move around, capture objectives if need be, or remain silent for a while. Stay somewhere out of line of sight, don't necessarily harass units, just sort of be quiet and unassuming while the louder units, like these, sort of take the brunt of the fire or the attention away, so that later on in the game we can run and capture some objectives. But if need be, they can sit back and lend some fire support. You've got a couple of heavy bolters in there, and they can move around quite quickly and get behind things and get into good firing lanes if you need it. But the idea here is to have some fast troops, objective capturing. And to sort of complement them, on the other side of that, the opposite end of the spectrum, I have a tactical squad with a missile launcher. So this one's pretty simple. Stay back. Stay somewhere nearby in your deployment zone, maybe, holding on to an objective somewhere. You've got a missile launcher to reach out and deal damage to something, and the sergeant I've given a storm bolter and a chainsword in case they get charged. He'll get an extra attack. So it's nothing too overwhelming. It's just a tactical squad. They've got a missile launcher to reach out. Really does take advantage of the reroll 1 hit, reroll 1 wound mechanic for that missile launcher. And again, this is just a cheap troop squad that is able to take objectives, maybe push out some damage, but otherwise be not really in the crosshairs of your enemy, just because it's not a heck of a lot compared to some of the other stuff that's here and some of the other stuff I'm about to put up here. And it fulfills a troop slot in the battalion detachment. So if you're counting, we've got 1 HQ so far, and then 2 troops. And then I have something else too. This is also for a little bit of staying power. So I've got a Rhino transport. I've got 2 storm bolters on top of it. And I've taken a full 10-man tactical squad. And these guys I've loaded so that they can sort of deal with just about anything, but also it's a big, chunky squad inside a transport. So it's well defended, it's relatively tough, and it's a troop unit, which means that you're getting that objective secured. You're getting a unit that can move relatively quickly inside the Rhino. And again, it's one of those things that is not a priority target, and if it is, it's pretty tough and it can handle itself pretty well. You've got to get through the Rhino, and then there are 10 Marines inside. So we've got, for the heavy weapon, we've got a plasma cannon, and then we've got a whole bunch of bolters. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolters. We've got a plasma gun and a combi plasma on the sergeant. So it is quite a chunk of points loaded into troops, but at the same time, it's quite useful. Now these guys will be ignoring mortal wounds on 5s, which is very cool. They're inside a transport, which is pretty decent armor. And tactics for these is pretty much wait and see what happens. It's not so much an attack squad as it is a let's see how the battlefield plays out for the first 2 turns. And then we can see, do we need to capture some objectives? Do we need to hunker down and deal some damage? What are you going to do? So potentially, first turn you have with this guy, you pop smoke. Make it harder for the enemy to hit the rhino, keep the troops inside. But of course that can change based on the game. You may want to take a different route depending on where the game has you. And then you've got 3 plasma weapons in the squad that are capable, much like the Hellblasters, not as good as they are, obviously, but much like the Hellblasters, the plasma weaponry is able to tackle some heavier targets. And then you've got bolt guns that are virtually the same range as the plasma weaponry, so they can kind of keep up, and you can either pour more shots onto something you want to kill or shoot at something else that's more sort of light infantry based. So that fills up the 3 troop slots that we've got. We've got the big squad of tactical marines, the small squad with the missile launcher, and the scouts inside here. So we've got enough troops to kind of handle any standard mission. They give us some command points, and we've got some durability as well. We've got the Landspeeder Storm storing the scouts, and while that means we're probably not scouting out the scouts during deployment, which you still could do, it means we're defending them. So not a bad call. We've got this squad in the back, probably throwing out a missile or 2, and then we've got the squad inside the rhino that's nice and defended. So the second HQ I've got for the battalion, I've got a captain on bike. This guy has a power sword and a storm shield. Storm shield for survivability. The bike allows him to zip around and support a variety of units with his aura ability. I will be giving him the Chapter Master stratagem, which basically means instead of re-rolling 1s to hit within 6 inches of him, you re-roll all hits within 6 inches of him. Incredibly, incredibly useful. So he can zoom up with the Storm Raven if you want to support that. He can keep up with some of the troops. He can stay back with the Hellblasters and lend fire there. Do all sorts of stuff like that. And I'll be giving him a relic as well. He'll be getting the Burning Blade, which, while it's not necessarily the best relic, it's very strong. So he'll be able to have +2 strength, -5 AP, and 2 damage. Or I believe it's +3 strength. So he'll be attacking at strength 7, which is quite strong. I haven't figured out a warlord trait yet, but we'll probably make it something along the lines of a close combat ability. Maybe the one that gives him +1 attack strength on the charge. Anyhow, so that's the second HQ for the battalion, and he's going to be the warlord. So we're going to make him the warlord. He's tougher because he's on a bike. He's got a storm shield that adds to his survivability, and he's got a very strong combat weapon, should it come to that. But for the majority, he is an aura ability on a bike. That's his job. He rolls around wherever you may need him, moving up 14 inches, advancing 6 should you need it. He doesn't really have much shooting, so advancing with him is not a big deal. The idea is to get him into position to offer the best support where you need it on the table. That's his job. Then we've got a couple of other small units. We've got a Redemptor Dreadnought, which I'm very happy with. This guy's pretty new for me. I found him used, so I was very happy to pick him up. And his job is to shred light infantry. That's his job. So I've equipped him with 2 storm bolters, the onslaught Gatling cannon under his fist, and the heavy onslaught Gatling cannon. Just anti-infantry firepower. That's it. And if he happens to move up close enough, he's got a fist that he can punch into tanks with, which is quite useful. But primarily, this guy is going to be a tough anti-infantry shredder. The onslaught Gatling cannon, the heavy one, has a pretty high range with 30. And then the mini onslaught Gatling cannon has 24-inch range, and it's all the same strength. You basically get 6 more shots. And if you're in range for this, you're also in range for 2 more storm bolters, which will just add firepower. I haven't added the Icarus rocket pod because it's 6 points that I don't feel really works for the way I've had him hooked up. So that's his job. Infantry killing, support, maybe punching a vehicle occasionally. We'll see. Then I've got another small unit. This is a support unit. So the idea behind this is a land speeder. Not one of the most popular units in the Codex, but there's a small point drop recently, and it's not that bad for the points anymore. So the way I've equipped this, I've given it a heavy flamer and a heavy bolter. So some light anti-infantry firepower, but what you're getting here is speed. You're getting something that can keep up with a lot of the other units on the table and lend support should they need it. So perhaps we could fly this around with the scout squad and have them work together. You've got linked up with both those squads a decent amount of anti-infantry firepower and support for the scouts should you need it in an extra heavy flamer and heavy bolter. These guys, as they are not a flyer, but they have the flyer keyword, this allows them to zip up and over buildings, over terrain, whatever you want. You've got fast movement of 14 inches, I believe. It might be 16. I forget, because this one actually has 2 inches more. Let me just double check. Either way, it's incredibly fast. I believe it's 14. It's 14 for bikes anyways. And then, let's see, land speeders. Oh, it's 16. Okay, so that means it's 16 inches for these guys to move and 18 for the land speeder storm. So very fast. And because they're land speeders, they auto advance 6 inches. So if you need to get somewhere quickly, you can. That's the idea behind this. Get somewhere quickly or lend support. Again, a lot of the roles of the units in this army will depend on the battlefield, the mission you're playing, your opponent's army, a variety of factors, how the game plays out in the next few turns. So I've added a few units, and I've added a lot of speed. There's a lot of speed in this list. Very few things are static. We've got a Rhino transporting troops. We've got scouts inside this transport. We've got a relatively fast Dreadnought. This guy moves 9. We've got a Storm Raven that can zip up the field. We have a captain on bike. We've got a land speeder now, and a chaplain with jump pack. So the only things that probably won't be moving a heck of a lot are this tactical squad with the missile launcher and the Hellblasters in the back, but as their weapons are rapid fire, they can move to get into position, just not very quickly. But the most of this army, most of it I put together for speed, to be able to get around where you need it. And the idea behind that is a staying power mechanic. So very often I've had games where I'll have this tactical squad at the backfield, turn 3 or 4, and I need them to do something, but they're across the field, so they can't really do that. Now, having a variety of units that can zip around really opens up my options and makes the battlefield a lot smaller for me. So I've added a few other units with this idea in mind. I've added a relatively big squad of Vanguard veterans. They all are equipped with jump packs, and I've added a few special weapons or close combat weapons based on the models I have. Nothing, necessarily optimized, but a way to take care of things with a lot of attacks in close combat. These guys, their primary role will be to engage light infantry on objectives and try and shred them off of that. Thinking things like if they get the charge on a small squad of Tyranids or like Gaunts or Guardsmen, something like that, they'll be able to cut them up in short order. The idea, again, speed with the jump packs and lots of attacks. As veterans, they each have 2 attacks base, and then there's shock assault, and a lot of them I've equipped with chain swords and bolt pistols, giving them each an additional attack. So I've got one guy with a power axe, one with a power sword, so able to deal with a little bit of armor. One of them I've given melta-bombs to, so they can huck that at a tank if they need to. And the sergeant's a little tougher. He's got a storm shield and lightning claw. Both the storm shield and lightning claw went down in price, so it's actually only 8 points for both of these together. Very useful, especially on the sergeant. You want him to stay alive. So he's going to be, you know, probably the last guy standing. You could say have the chaplain flying up with them, should you choose, instead of in the Storm Raven. Again, some versatility. It allows you to play around with what does the battlefield look like, what's the mission, where do I want to lend support, that sort of thing. So, we've got that. What else have we got? I've got a drop pod. Poosh! Right here. So, I've taken a drop pod with a storm bolter inside, and I have got a bit of a suicide squad. So I've taken some company veterans. I have got 1, 2, 3 combi meltas, and then 2 melta guns. So this unit right here is going to be very, very damaging. And what you could do with this, considering you've got the reroll 1 hit, reroll 1 wound mechanic, you could actually split them into 2 squads. A unit of veterans, company veterans, only needs to be 2 minimum. So you could have 2 small squads, each getting a reroll to hit and to wound, should you so choose. Or you could have them as 1 big squad. It's up to you. So they go in there, and they'll be accompanied by the 3rd HQ in the list, a lieutenant. This lieutenant has a storm bolter for a little bit of cheap firepower, and a power fist. The idea here is the pod drops in, these guys nuke something, and from behind the pod, but still within 6 inches, the lieutenant lends his reroll 1s to wound for the squad and their melta guns. So these guys will be very, very reliable. And if you're worried about the lieutenant dying, your opponent will have to kill this squad, which will probably happen because 5 melta guns jumping in somewhere is very threatening. Although if you're able to isolate a target, that can be very useful. But then, depending on how you place it, if you throw down this squad inside the drop pod, your opponent will have to destroy them, destroy the drop pod, and then kill the lieutenant. But if you play your cards right, if you play the table right, you should be able to drop these guys in, whether it's turn 1 or turn 2, and have other units already up the field considering the speed of most of the army. So that way this squad, when it drops in, is not isolated, and your opponent now has a bunch of meltas and maybe some veterans or a storm raven or some scouts and a land speeder in their face, and they'll have a variety of targets they have to deal with right away. Because if you drop this guy in all the way at the other end of the field, and yeah, sure, they kill a tank, that's great. They're alone, they're exposed, they will die. Now, if you drop them in closer to reinforcements, then you can increase their survivability, and they may stick around longer. The only issue here is that you've got melta range, which is very, very short. But this may coerce you to drop them in turn 2 or 3, because as a drop pod, you can drop in turns 1, 2, or 3 now. There is a temptation to drop in turn 1, always, just because you can. And you're the only army that can at this point anyways. But it might be better to drop them in turn 2 or turn 3. It might help you out. So this is an ace in your sleeve, effectively. This is something you might want to keep in your pocket for a while to be like, boom, drop this down, that thing needs to die. And then finally, one last thing, because with the points we have, I've taken an attack bike, and I've given it a multi-melta. That's it. This sort of serves the same purpose as the land speeder. It can zip around and be a threat, or it can sort of stick back and hide behind things, and then later in the game maybe come in and capture an objective should you need it, or harass something, or it can lend its support to something else that's equally fast. You could easily have a nice little spear with the land speeder storm, and the scouts, and this attack bike. You'd be able to deal with a lot of anti-infantry, or sorry, you'd be able to deal with a lot of infantry, and the multi-melta can really threaten tanks. Especially with that one reroll to hit, reroll to wound, the multi-melta is quite nice. So again, what I've gone for is speed. Speed, versatility. Now, like I said, there are a lot of other ways you could get similar rolls with similar units. Or, sorry, similar rolls with different units. So instead of the drop pod, I could take a unit of bikes with melta guns for sort of the same idea. The idea here is that I'm not saying this should be your army. I'm saying this is an idea of how to play something. So I've got enough command points. I've got tactics that can deal with pretty much anything that comes my way rather effectively. I'm not mono building against something too. I'm not saying like, oh, okay, I'm anticipating lots of infantry, so I'm going to build my list to deal with infantry. I've got things to deal with heavier targets as well. We've got a multi-melta, we've got melta guns over here, the 3 heavy weapon systems on this guy. This guy can punch tanks if he wants to. We've got a missile launcher back here, some plasma around over here, and the Hellblasters in the back. So plenty of stuff to deal with some heavier targets. We've got some good opportunity for some interesting stratagems. A heavy bolter, for example, for Hellfire shells. This can fire a flak missile should you need it to hit something in the skies. All sorts of stuff. We've got a Dreadnought that could potentially have a captain for a phase where he can get the aura of reroll ones to hit around him. And this dude has a monstrous base. So 6 inches around him is quite big. That could be very, very useful. We've got plasma to deal with just about anything. And we've got speed, which is very, very, very useful. It really sort of fits into the Space Marine idea of like a shock assault squad or a shock assault army where you push super quickly and get in the face of your opponent and then blast them or slice them up in close combat. So the reroll to hit and to wound helps across the board. Every single thing in this list will take advantage. Every single thing in this list, regardless of close combat or shooting, will be more effective for it. And every single thing in this list will avoid mortal wounds on a 5-up, which will just increase your staying power. So this was sort of the idea that I wanted to put together. Now, I said you could do this with other armies. You sort of can. Now, Space Marines have the benefit of having so many damn units that there's a lot to choose from for a variety of different roles, so you may find yourself with fewer options depending on the army you're playing. But you should be able to do a lot of the same stuff as these units. So, okay, you don't have a bunch of tactical Marines, but you have intercessors. Just use the intercessors instead. They fulfill sort of the same role as these guys where they sit at the back, they hold on to an objective, and they can tag people from afar. That's sort of the idea. Or if you don't want the Vanguard veterans, then you can take Inceptors, the ones who drop down and fire heavy bolter rounds or plasma rounds. It's effectively the same thing. It's fast and it hits something quickly. You have the ability to deep strike. Maybe you don't want to do close combat. You want to do more shooting. That's fine. But it fulfills the same role. That's the idea. Just like the Hellblasters, a squad of Devastators would do pretty much the same thing, just in a different fashion. Maybe you've got different weapons you want to use, what have you. That's sort of the idea here. You could easily replace this guy right here, the Storm Raven, with a repulsor or a Land Raider, another big beefy unit that can dish out some damage and transport some high priority troops. So it's not necessarily use these units, it's build the army a certain way to use your units to their maximum effectiveness, depending on how you want to build them too. Because if you want to build your models a certain way and use them a certain way, try to make an army that will fit that. Try to make a list where each unit has a job to do. It's often I come up against armies where I've seen a guy and he's got all these cool toys that he wants to play with, but there's virtually no synergy whatsoever. So the list doesn't work. It's a bunch of cool things that kind of work on their own, but they don't work together, and they're not necessarily used as, they don't really have a purpose in game. So it's best when putting together a list, when thinking of your army, when putting an army together, what jobs are they going to do? How do you want to play the army? And how do you deal with a variety of targets? How do you deal with both heavy and light targets? Should you come up against either of them? So that's sort of what I want to convey here. Anyhow, if you have any questions or you want to know, how do you want to equip units, that sort of thing, let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to help you out. But as a short answer to any questions like that, first I would say, how do you want to play it? What do you want the unit to do? How do you want to play them? Where do you want to place them? And what role do they fulfill in your army? Anyhow, thanks for listening, guys, and I will see you again next time.